Can each of you introduce yourselves and share your background?
At the University of Amsterdam at the moment, and in general, an innovation mentor, especially around Web3 and AI. I've always worked in my career around digital transformations in big corporations and with own startups. So that's a bit the juice of it.
Awesome, Mark. Great to have you on the webinar series today, everyone. So my name's Sam. I co-founded Zengate Global several years ago, but before I got into the supply chain sort of technology space, I worked as a management consultant across several markets, starting off in Sydney, and yeah, worked with a lot of different companies, mainly big corporations like banks, insurance, and telecommunications companies, and ultimately worked towards building up the digital assets and blockchain practice with several partners out in New York and in the EU region as well. But that's my background. Great to be here, and keen to get into some questions.
Why is supply chain transparency and equity such a pressing issue today? What are some of the most significant problems we continue to see?
There are probably different types of supply chain. There's the physical supply chain, and nowadays there's also the digital supply chain. Um, Sam, I guess you speak more also about the physical supply chain, but my background is especially in the digital supply chain. So if you see what's happening in AI, the supply chain is about the data. So where does the data come from? What type of data it is? How it's cleaned up and produced? And of course, that goes along with the physical supply chain as well, because you can capture a lot of data along it. Um, why is it such a big issue? That let me stick with the example of AI. Is that you want to understand what is the output of the AI. So, and that depends on what the input is. And equally, I think we nowadays want to know what went into a product, whether it's sustainable enough, who worked with it. And having that transparency allows us to act differently. At the moment, those are more like black boxes.
Yeah, really interesting that you brought up the part around the digital footprint and digital traceability and digital supply chains. So I typically sort of group it all together. But speaking from a physical point of view, we started getting into this space around 2020 or so, was when I was getting a little bit more interested in traceability and provenance related solutions. But if you think back to 2020, everything got shocked with COVID, and we saw huge issues with supply chain resilience being tested, month after month. And then if you think about where we're at today as well in 2025, it hasn't actually been all that long, but we're in a completely different paradigm. Um, there's tariffs and trade wars happening. We've got actual wars happening. There's all sorts of different emerging technologies, like markets that are mentioned with AI and the access to data, and so thinking about it from that point of view, like the resilience of supply chains is like as important as ever. And when I think about like what makes a resilient supply chain, it's really making sure that all of the pieces are highly incentivized and working really well with one another. And in my eyes, to say your supply chain is resilient is synonymous to making sure that it's transparent and it's equitable. And that sort of ensuring that the incentives have always been aligned, ultimately distills down to agricultural supply chains, making sure people get paid fairly, their rights are being protected, they've got access to transparent feeds on pricing or what's happening in other markets, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's it's extremely important today. It impacts a lot of people, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But I think it's a really important problem for people to be working on, and there are many sort of excellent projects out there that are building in this space and ensuring that things continue to stay intact and then continue to get better.
I like that, Sam, what you're saying. There are a couple of aspects why it's important. Huh? And you're speaking about the fairness. And in our, or in my recent startup, we also looked at the fair participation. Because what you see along the supply chain, especially with AI, if you give your personal data, it's maybe not much worth. Huh? But once you combine it and connect it with a lot of others and you build an AI around, all of a sudden you can make millions out of it. But the ones who contributed actually don't have anything from it, apart maybe from a free service in that sense. So there's a big topic about the fair participation that you manage, that you also see what happens with the contribution that somebody maybe around the world does and what happens with it on the other side. The second aspect, I think, is having a better choice. So users can see what is actually in the box that they are buying and then choose. So it's not about for the producer to choose, but for the consumer. And for that, you need to know. And the other aspects you mentioned are we always thought the supply chain is kind of stable in the way how you build it up. But now you even have to protect it. You have to ensure it stays stable and that you can further optimize it.
Who do these challenges ultimately impact? Do you have stories?
The sort of overarching answer is everyone, right? At the end of the day, like it impacts every single person, whether you're a consumer that wants traceable or information around where you're getting your foods from, that it's, maybe it's pesticide free, that free of unnatural chemicals going into your body. We all care about stuff like that, all the way down through the supply chain as well. Most of these supply chains, at least in many of the agricultural markets we've sort of done some work in, it's heavily reliant on smallholders and businesses of all sorts of sizes inside of that supply chain, whether you're a small logistics company or a large logistics player doing freight or air all around the world, all the way through to governments as well, right? Many of these governments, at least in the markets we've dealt with, often have a visibility issue around what's actually happening in their country. They might have access to export information around like what's leaving their country, but even inside, there is sort of not as granular information about what's actually happening within their markets or within their supply chains. If you really think about, as a business or as an individual, like you make decisions based on data that you can have access to, right? A business might make decisions on, the health of their balance sheet or the way their revenues are changing. And that's how you sort of make good decisions. But from a government's point of view, how can you make good policy decisions for your constituents or for the businesses? How do you attract more investments into the space if you don't have access to that data? So it really impacts everyone. The interesting thing is that it impacts everyone in different ways, and some markets impacted more than others. And that sort of goes to the next point, which is many of these emerging markets that we've actually done some work in, and maybe from a social impact point of view, many sort of companies or projects focus on, because there's still quite a significant gap in terms of where they are today and maybe where some of these other developed markets are. It's a huge opportunity to leapfrog as well. So um, we're entering an interesting paradigm where the gaps might seem really big and the challenges might seem really big. But as Mark had mentioned before, with the movement of AI and the intersection of several technologies like blockchain and the use of IoTs and sort of like cloud solutions, there can be a lot of catch up that can happen at least.
Yeah, and I think if you look a bit back, we still come from that period where we try to understand and analyze and make transparent the supply chain. Nowadays, especially in the digital supply chain, there are people who are actively influencing that supply chain. So if you look at misinformation or people spamming, let's say, the AI models and the training data of it. So those are new mechanisms that are maybe known along the physical chain. If you want to interfere it, what we hear there on the either wanted or unwanted there, that the shipping got blocked, or maybe disrupted in the one or the other way. But in the digital age, that is new, that you can also actively influence it, spam it, manipulate the data. And so for that, as you say, I think it's everyone who's affected, who's using it, and understanding it where it comes from. Kids in school learn where you grow the food, and it's not just in the supermarket, or electricity doesn't just come from the plug. You need to understand the full chain to also appreciate it. And sometimes you have to relearn that when it became a commodity.
And just to like yeah, and also in terms of like stories we've seen, there's like, if you really think about it, if you were to look online, there's an abundance of examples of things not working, right? Like we've seen riots, not riots but protests, sorry, protests happening in with farmers in all sorts of places around the world. Europe has been a big sort of eye for the media, at least for the last couple of years, with farmers being upset with what's happening. All sorts of stories in places like Africa and parts of Asia of poor wage conditions or poor working conditions as well. And many people at the end of the supply chain have no idea that's happening, right? But the flip side is that there's also a number of really good cases of situations where, whilst there are challenges, there are actual solutions, at least in the micro of things being done well. And one of my favorite examples is, I think about a year ago, so we'd gone and done a trip to Sri Lanka to go meet some of our customers, and there were several group of tea producers who had completely flipped the script in terms of what and sort of how good practice looks like in terms of running a tea factory. And these tea producers are some of the best artisan tea makers in the world, and they effectively pay above market rate to source their tea leaves from the farmers around sort of their factory and in their community. And there's a system in terms of the flow back of the revenues that they make back into that community as well. And they're sourcing really high quality leaf. They're putting a lot of work into creating a high quality product and then selling it at a higher premium. And you just see that flow back come through the community. The factories are, and so the makers are very cognizant in terms of making sure that there's fair wage outcomes, that the communities are funded. Like I can think of one example of a producer who is in the middle of rebuilding a school, for example. And so all sorts of these big sort of maybe non-financial impacts are flowing through the community, and everyone's aligned, everyone's incentivized, and there's a whole lot of change and impact happening on the ground. And I'd love to see more of that. I know there are heaps of stories that I can't think of off the top of my head because maybe I haven't met them yet, I haven't read about it. But whilst we do talk a lot about challenges and problems and issues, there are lots of great examples of people innovating on the ground, having an actual tangible impact. And I just wanted to highlight that just because I was very impressed, but it probably doesn't get talked about enough, at least when we talk about transparent and sort of equitable supply chains. We focus typically on all of the issues, which I think is a good place to start. But we need to be able to see that there are solutions out there that work.
Where do you see technology making the biggest impact in solving these problems?
Yeah, I guess building on what Sam just said, the new thing with the blockchain is that you can add an economic layer. It's not just creating more transparency, but you can really act upon that transparency and also exchange value. And as you said, it's about the smallholders participating in the end of the supply chain. First, being transparent about it and knowing what happens, but also how does the value flow back? At the moment, it flows back step by step, manually by manual. So you have a lot of chances to influence it. In our startup, we were looking at ways how you can use smart contracts, that each contribution you make to the end product can be automatically then rewarded, and you can participate in the value add that you have at the end. If you want, you can get paid just for, I don't know, the hour you spend working. That's one thing, you have directly, but you could participate also in the increase of value along the value chain, and then if the product gets sold, pay back. And to give you an example, in the sustainability field, a lot is kind of transacted now with the CO2 certificates. Whether the system works or not, but it's a new economic mechanism. And what it allows is that everybody who, let's say, nurtures a tree or grows a tree could then participate in that mechanism. And the payback. So if a certificate gets sold and money enters that flow, how does that go back to the, let's say, the tree at the end, who is the actual participant and contributor in that sense? So that logic, I think, is a key enabler and change now from technology, especially blockchain. Of course, you have other technologies that can help you, improve the supply chain, analyze patterns like AI. So there are many more things you can add to it, but technology in the global spread of the supply chain provides a bit of a common language. It's a bit, if you look at companies, SAP became a bit the backbone for accounting. So it's a trusted base where you can then analyze, build a transparency that you still with humans, with auditors, where you can still work then with it. And I would imagine something similar on a supply chain base. I think the European Union advanced policies in that direction already and trying to find the right balance and the right pacing for it. But technology certainly is an enabler across all the different environments you might have where the supply chain comes from.
Yeah, and just to add, yeah, on top of that, one of the big things which is often overlooked as well is access to internet. And we're sort of friends with a project called World Mobile that's sort of actively working on those types of solutions. They've got different sorts of ways of doing that. One of my favorite ways they do that is they have an aerostat, it's like a big balloon that's I think several hundred feet in the sky, connects to a Starlink, and then creates like a meshed layer to give access to internet access to people sort of on the ground that typically don't have access. And I think it's completely underlooked, right? Because if you don't have access to internet, how are you supposed to know what the market price is that you can sell at, or how are you supposed to keep up to date with best practice of farming or tilling or different sorts of agricultural techniques? So I think that's typically the base layer to get right. And there's billions of people still unconnected in the world, and many of whom probably work in critical supply chains that we rely on. And so beyond that, like just basically just echoing what Mark said, right? Like AI is a no brainer. Like for me, I think the reason why it's so interesting is because many supply chains have different nuances, and that's something like we've picked up on. So even if you run a sort of cooperative style structure or a factory style structure, different markets do different businesses do things differently. They have different policies, different procedures, different ways of doing stuff. And when you think about like prior solutions, they'll sort of plug and play, like custom. You have these templates that you can pick from. But I think we'll be entering a world where you can customize things basically instantaneously, make them fit your solution, and that really I think will accelerate things, especially for businesses that really aren't using technology today as well. Many of whom, which we've spoken to, are still reliant on sort of writing things down on paper, and you run into all sorts of issues. So I think huge digitization opportunity, and then I think, like Mark said, like payments technology in general, I think makes things more transparent, auditable at the end of the day, and more frictionless as well. So I think those are sort of the things I think about in sort of more broadly speaking in terms of where the big impacts are going to be.
Blockchain is often discussed as a solution for transparency. How do you see its real-world application in supply chains today?
Well, as we said, I think it's the backbone of it, or it can be the backbone. And I think already since the first hypes in blockchain, that was one of the main use cases, apart from crypto itself. But really, like, have this immutable and transparent tracking along it. In the physical space, you can also do it with RFID chips or barcodes. So the idea there is not new. So the technology in that sense is more a question: can it be more efficient? Can it be more inclusive? Can it be more affordable or reach more people? So that is also why blockchain is a real technology and should be treated as such. I think it's often mixed up with another use case, the crypto use case, which is also an exciting field. But I think it's important to differentiate the base technology from the use cases. So, in that sense, it is a solution for transparency, but the second aspect is also just by having the blockchain doesn't mean that you can make it transparent for everybody. Yeah? So even if you have internet, you still need to be able to read it, yeah? To access it. So yes, it might be freely available, but you need to also have the capabilities to read it and to analyze it. So I do believe, and that's something we're working at the university at, is finding ways that you can analyze it, that you can make the insights accessible. And that is, there's a public interest, but there's then an auditing interest, and there's certainly also private interests. So that is, I think, then the new social challenge. So how to balance those transparencies. You see that also with the clouds or others. You always find these mix into hybrid solutions. Sometimes it's good to work in the open. Sometimes it's also beneficial to keep it a bit protected, either for sensitivity reasons or to keep an innovation drive. I think altogether we have to figure out what the right balance of that is. But I think we've seen it in the e-business or in many other digital transitions. It's good to test right and left, but striving for the right balance, that is where ultimately the societal impact happens.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Mark had to say. I don't only extra thing I'll add from our point of view, like because of the way we're building things, is how composable and how modular some of these components are, right? So when we think about the Web 2 world, we have all these great software solutions and products that many of us use today, but they sit sort of in their own little ecosystem. And whilst there's been big efforts in terms of connecting them to different platforms or different ecosystems, they do sort of run in these sort of siloed ways. And the best example is like the way payments occur, right? Like when I want to buy something from a shop, there's an inventory system and that manages everything. And then the payments layer is done somewhere completely different. Like Visa takes care of it, and then they interact with our banks, and then they settle everything. So the cool thing about blockchain is, like, whilst they're modular components, they also interact with one another. You can see payments alongside the immutable sort of provenance of where you got your stuff from. You can start. I think the bit that gets really interesting is you can start plugging in different use cases. Like for me, I'm a big fan of, well, ultimately where I think DeFi and like decentralized insurance will go, which is going to have a huge impact. As soon as you have production or yield data, and weather data, it's like you can more accurately provide insurance basically for people that might not have access to it. But I think the key takeaway though is these systems are global. You're not reliant on one single like payment gateway because you live in a certain country and there's foreign exchange restrictions with the way the local currency works. Like we're living and building businesses in a new paradigm where you can accept funds in a permissionless way and conduct trade with people all around the world. And I think it's that sort of access bit that I think really excites me, that these sort of older, not old, but these sort of more Web 2 based solutions haven't really been able to benefit from.
How can technology help improve social impact challenges such as labor and wage transparency?
Yeah, as we said, I think all type of data you can, of course, put on the blockchain or handle with the blockchain. So the content is, in my view, independent of the technology that you use. So it's more about the willingness, and that's a political or social process. So, do you want to make these information transparent? Do you want to benchmark them, or how do you want to handle them? And that is something I think you see in all digital transformations. We believe that technology solves it all. And yes, it can solve some aspects, but technology always has to be embedded in the socio-technical system. So, how do you govern it? Who uses it? How do you deal with abuse of the systems? And yeah, how what changes come from it? So, if you now have new insights, um, how do you deal with them, and how do you again balance them? So in that sense, it's important that you always look at it as a integrated inclusive system, and it's more about what role does the blockchain play in that architecture. So another example is, because you mentioned the insurance topics, and that I think was one of the key examples at the beginning, that you can automatically execute, an insurance against yield miscarriage, or a wrong yield because of the weather. And then you can determine whether the weather was really bad, and that automatically releases the money. So basically, a fixed smart contract. And that works if you have clear and already agreed rules. Then you can also just optimize them in putting them in such a contract. What you see on the other side, and we were experimenting a lot in the startup field, with new voting mechanisms, with new, as we said, fair participation mechanisms. And what I saw there is that if you try to use a fixed and even immutable contract, that doesn't help you to experiment. So then you can't change it or adapt it. And a lot of the, let's say, impact or growth, you need to adapt, you need to find that balance. So there's, I think, a bit of a paradox that on the one side we have fixed smart contracts that can automate, let's say, in my view, things that we all have a consensus on and could agree. But to experiment with them, I think we need to find other ways to sandbox, to allow some adaptation. And that is where the impact starts growing, because people can, build trust into it. It's not just a stiff rule that comes there and you can take it or leave it. It's something you can adapt and grow with it. And once a community or along a whole supply chain, everybody agrees, then you can fix it and optimize it and scale it. So I think this is a important perspective to see how to balance, the innovation dynamic with the efficiency part.
Yeah, and I think the other bit as well, like which I think Mark touched on with the idea around like having a sandbox, is I think we need to make a distinction between using technology to reveal the issues that we might have in the supply chain. So that could be, poor wage conditions, poor labor conditions, like, people not getting paid properly or being mistreated. But I think the more important bit is like, okay, now that you know that data, how do you then have an impact in basically making that better? And, we talked a little bit about governments having access to data from a policy point of view. But I think, like what Mark mentioned around sandboxes, is like, how do you then use this data to create different initiatives or different solutions that ultimately have the impact that we're after? One of the things might be, some markets might not care about transparent supply chains. They just want cheap products. Maybe they don't care too much about the quality. Like we see this fragmentation in lots of different markets. Like coffee, for example, you've got commodity coffee, you've got specialty coffee, and it ultimately ends up in different markets. So if you know some of this stuff, you can sort of redirect things, where they're valued more, right? Maybe it's the Middle East cares a lot more about these specialty products, and you find a way to ensure that these producers that are producing these sort of products get matched with these buyers, who ultimately pay what the fair price is of that, and that ultimately flows back into the supply chain, and into those communities, and so you can have an impact. So I think one bit, like, just to summarize, is sure, like, collect the data, that's great, but what are you supposed to do with it, which ultimately has an impact and improves the livelihoods of those people in the supply chain.
Can you share any real-world examples of companies or initiatives using tech to address social impact issues in supply chains?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, Cengate is probably one good example, so you can speak a bit more about that. We're in my previous company, we try to build data unions, so have people really be part of where the data goes and participate then in the AI. As I said, we applied that in a hackathon, prototype to reforestation. So how does the flow back then from the income from, let's say, a CO2 certificate can flow back to a tree, and compensate or reward all people along that chain. We worked there together with a project, it's called YOMA from UNICEF. They looked also at, let's say, the skill supply chain. So if you have young people and talent who want to work outside their communities, how do you make sure that people can trust their CV or their previous experiences and micro credentials? There are examples where you also in the blockchain, yeah, how can you now trust contributions? You saw POAP, who gives you badges or participation certificates in that sense, up to zero knowledge trust mechanism. So at the end, all these examples boil back to what you can trust and whom you can trust. And the question is all the trust in the technology and in the algorithms, or is the trust actually in a partially permissioned hybrid system? Yeah? So how do you actually combine the social system and the technology system? I think this is where we are at, yeah? Because technology enabled also the discussion, like how to govern it, how to balance it, how to trust it, yeah, before you can scale it. So in that sense, I think there are many examples, and the question is what aspect you want to use the technology for.
Yeah, and just like, and from my point of view, like, yeah, I think as Mark said, like, lots of different, like, verticals that you can have an impact in. So there's companies that just focus on deforestation reporting, or the creation of, like, carbon credits or CO2 reports. You have protocols focused on peer-to-peer finance and lending and crowdfunding, which make access to finance a whole lot easier. But I actually think the favorite one, that I've had for several years now, was it came across because of some conversations I was having with one of our board advisors, Lamont Rutten, and he's a very well-known operator of commodity exchanges. And you know commodity exchanges have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but you get to actually see the real world and sort of tangible impacts that you can have on the ground when these things get run properly. So Lemon, so very well known for running the Indian Multi Commodities Exchange, um, and the Indonesian commodities and, I think, derivatives exchange. And he was telling me, when done right, and you've got the right warehousing and so warehouse receipt systems, you give farmers an opportunity to be able to store their goods, an opportunity for them to know what the price of their products are, an opportunity for them to decide when they want to sell, or if they want to borrow money against it. And I think exchanges and marketplace platforms provide an enormous impact on the ground. It provides stability to the products that they're trying to sell, and far more flexibly than they used to have as well. So, I think those are some of my favorite examples, which are very well encompassing in terms of the impact they have on millions and millions of people all around the world. Well, the other example, Mark, I'm not sure if we've sort of talked about this before, is we're doing a pilot right now in Zambia, and we're in the process of tracking the honey supply chain over there for one of our customers. And they're sourcing from thousands of small holders across different regions of Zambia. And for those that don't know who are listening, honey is one of the most adulterated products in the world, right? And uh, this company specifically, they work with several different organizations, buyers that care about like where their products are from, but as well as donors and supporters who care about the sort of ESG components of their own supply chain. So there's one really interesting element of some of the work we're doing, which is really digitizing and making the data far more transparent in real time. Which is really exciting, and so building different sort of tooling and sort of dashboards behind that. But the other bit as well is being able to track things like payments as well, which are going to farmers. So it's a really interesting project that we're working on, which I think, yeah, really encompasses some of the stuff we talked about today, which is how do you make the supply chains more transparent, but utilizing tools like blockchain in a way sort of under the hood that a lot of different stakeholders will benefit from, not only the business itself, but the farmers, governments, and the buyers who ultimately, because of the portability of this data, be able to share this stuff with their own customers, which I think has been sort of this dream I think people have had when it comes to blockchain use cases. But it's really fun to be able to work on these sort of projects.
How do we ensure that these technologies benefit the most vulnerable workers in the supply chain rather than just adding complexity for businesses?
Well, I think we mentioned already that if people really want to be part of that supply chain, I mean, I also experienced that not everybody really want to think that far. Huh? They're more interested in is there a way to get a better price or earn more direct money. But for those who want to think a bit beyond, and that could also be the organizations they are part of or supporting organizations who now have other means to advocate or leverage. I think that is a way that it's not the individual who has to manage now the whole complex supply chain, but that the intermediaries and the layers on top of it, they have more means and you can create more insights in there. So that is the way how I think you can allow people to have either a say in it, yeah, if they want to constructively contribute to it or to benefit differently from it. The enablers are here now, no? And I think the question, like with many other technologies, is often not in the technology itself. It's now the next phase is how we use it, how we make it happen, and that is more of a social or governing process.
Yeah, I think I'm really not sure what else to add on top of that, but I think the key bit is the when implementing these things, there are a lot of social and sort of customary things that have to be thought of on the ground. Like we've seen that in some of the work that we do, and it's often the most vulnerable people that find it most difficult to sort of change and adapt as well. We've noticed, and part of that means working with the stakeholders around them, and sort of slowly sort of ensuring that adoption takes place. And digitization is the first step, and I yeah, making sure you get the basics right first, I think is really important. Make sure people have phones, access to internet, and then sort of ensure that payments can take place, and then the rest sort of ultimately will sort of work itself out. But like Mark said, these things are not easy, and you need to be working with the right partners to make it possible.
What's one key takeaway you'd like the audience to remember from today's discussion?
Yeah, for me, and I mean, it reflects a bit my own journey, huh, where I stepped out of the corporate environment, went into venturing around that new technology, basically enjoying the freedom to see what is really possible. But now, being back at the university, because I realized that there's what we discussed so much to do. So for me, it's really this combination of the socio-technical collaboration. Yeah? So how can you make use of the enabling? How can you deal with the insights? And I think this is still a field to crack. How those two worlds can really, in a constructive way, move forward. That's what I'm excited about at the university, because there's so much more, research, but also experimentation and education to be done. And I think we can do that in a more innovative way of action learning.
Yeah, and I think on my side, like I think just like yeah, similar to Mark, like reflecting on my own career, right? Like supply chains aren't like when you sort of come out of university, at least for me, it's like it's not the first thing you think of as a career. It's not the most sexy sort of job or industry, but I think the reality is because of the way the world's heading, like supply chains and sort of resources, products are only going to get more important as the nation states sort of conduct trade with one another, and it's a huge problem that ultimately impacts everyone. So I think the key takeaway is like no one's sort of exempt from some of the shocks and changes which are about to take place over the next 5, 10, 20 years in sort of these markets. So I think that's been a key realization for me, and like get involved. There needs to be more funding, more people sort of actively working on these problems because they're huge problems. They're impacting in some cases billions of people. So really excited to see like what the future has to hold, and I think being at the intersection of all of it, with being able to see stuff happening in the AI space, the blockchain space, and then just like the politics of supply chains as well has been really interesting and sort of exciting, at least for us.
Where can attendees learn more or get involved in solutions?
Yeah, I think in general at the university, so that is a space to, pick knowledge, share knowledge, but also to experiment and do deeper research. And very practically, with the Dutch Blockchain Week, for instance, we're organizing a hackathon in May. So those are also ways to engage around specific use cases or topics. And our idea is that together with corporate or startup partners, that works much better in an open ecosystem environment. It's not about sitting in one own's room and just thinking about it. It's also not just about hacking something together. It's really entering into that dialogue in smaller projects, in lectures. So I'm a strong believer in developing these kind of action learning formats together. Huh?
Yeah, and on our side, like if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the work that we're doing, we're quite active on Twitter and on YouTube and LinkedIn. So Zengate Global, we're building all sorts of different solutions for supply chains using things like blockchain and IoTs and in the future AI. But I think in general, if you're interested in learning about supply chains, just start watching some videos or speak to some people you might know in the space. I think some of the best places to learn as well is just go look up some of the biggest and best consulting firms out there have all sorts of interesting reports that you can learn heaps about. But the other ones that I like are the development agencies. They're very active in some of the markets that we've sort of talked about today. And they've got all sorts of interesting information and reports and videos about the sort of projects that they're active in as well all around the world. So, if you're looking for some, Asian Development Bank, I think Solidaritat are some, the favorite sort of development agencies I've been following on LinkedIn or sort of on their websites as well. So, yeah, lots of learning materials out there, but reach out to people that you might know or reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to speak to you about some of these challenges and opportunities.